Okay, we've kind of touched on some of those issues. First of all, was the actual property thing, and then we want to get into a little bit on contracts. The couple areas that I did want to touch on as it deals with property issues that we may be listing or selling, and first of all is access. Do you have access? And I'm sure somebody has a horror story about access, don't we?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Dave's got it.
Yeah, access or even road frontage to a property can be extremely important. If you cannot get to a property, or if there's difficulty where you have to go through a creek or a stream, or there's a bridge to get back to it, there could be some significant discounts in what property might be worth as compared to another property. Even in McLean County here, McLean County, Illinois, we've got a couple instances where we've sold properties where either you had to go across a bridge and a creek to get back to it. There was an easement through there, but it was difficult to get a combine across the bridge, and so then you had to take an easement through another route, through a neighbor's field, and that became a $2,000 an acre discount right off the bat. So things like that, access can be a real issue. Sometimes pipeline easements and things of that nature are not seen as something that's extremely helpful. And so as a result, people may take a discount as regarding that too.
And another thing that I've thought about a little bit about access that maybe we can throw into that mix is access to markets.
Yeah, sure. True too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But back on to a listing I had last winter, I think it was, over at Eureka, and it was like a panhandle. It was a really nice farm, but at 60 foot. And it wasn't an easement, it was an ownership back to the major portion of the ground. Well, 60 foot, yeah, that was no frontage on the property at all, other than that. So to get your equipment back there, and it wasn't a road, it was cultivated. So I know I took a discount on that. It was a great farm, good PI, but that's what you get into when you're in those kind of situations.
One thing too, I would suggest strongly, and it's not that anybody is trying to give you bad information, I don't think, but a lot of times in the past, when it looks like a farm might have an issue with access, where you can clearly see that a road doesn't touch it, and you ask them, so is it accessed with an easement? And a lot of times they're like, oh yeah, like for years we've been going down this road right here. Well, is it recorded? They don't know if it's recorded. So
Right.
I ran into that once early on in my career, and I think that's just the main thing I would stress to anybody is if they say, even if they tell you it's recorded, I would look on down to the recorder's office at the courthouse and try to be able to prove that, because that's going to be one of the first questions you get when you take that to the marketplace is, how do you get there and is it recorded? And so that's a mistake that can be avoided.
And along those same lines, one way you can make sure, not make sure, but one way that you can also potentially learn how to do that is through a title commitment. So getting some preliminary title report.
Exactly.
That way you know ahead of time before you take that property to market, possibly whether or not it's got a true easement or other things that you didn't know about that gets brought up, so you can address those before you even price the farm to the market.
And one of the things, and I think this is a good time to talk about a little bit about pricing, because it always comes down to pricing, but another one I think we'd all like to have $5 for is every time some neophyte asks you, say, what are farms selling for now? And they have no idea. And unfortunately, most agents, unless you deal in farm or licensees, don't know. And quite honestly, none of us would know, except for the fact that we have that experience and know where to go get the data and understand those. And why don't we address that just a little bit?
Well, there's several ways, and I think it's a great question. To me, the value of the organization we're sitting in right now is we talk to each other. Yeah, we're friendly competitors, no question about it, but we're also sharing information on what's going on out there. What are you seeing in your land market for the kind of farm? And we know what your listings are, so we find out after you sold them what they are. There's various ways we can get comparable sales analysis. Acre's one of them. There's other people out there that are doing this kind of work. But it's very important that we get as close to our knowledge pool as we can as to what is the potential value of that property, because that's what you're bringing to the market. And the buyers, excuse me, the buyers think they know, the sellers have no clue in many cases, and sometimes they have it 4 years ago what they thought the property's worth, not today.
Absolutely, and that's, you know, because I still have people come up to me and say, oh, the ground's still selling for $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 an acre.
Yep.
Well, yeah, the very best did at the very top of the market, and, you know, now, of course, we all know that that's not true, and I think that's, you know, it's kind of the same thing when, you know, if somebody asks any of the three of you, what's houses selling for in Bloomington? You know, I mean, it's the same kind of question.
I don't know.
You know, and so I think, you know, the value that you bring to this is knowing all of these issues, and conversely, you know, farm brokers not understanding the residential issues.
And one thing you see is that, again, I think the sellers mean well, but they heard of this sale that did go for 12. Went for an auction, maybe the PI at 143, excellent drainage. My farm must be worth at least that much. Well, your PI is about 132, and you got bad drainage. You have to kind of educate them as to why there is a differential in the marketplace.
Yeah, and the big, you know, the big sales got the headlines and got the coffee shops abuzz, but that was in 2013 and 2014, and I think time flies fast for us all, and so sometimes you have to kind of help them reevaluate their own stance. And getting back to your question, I get that sometimes, like, so what's farmland going for? And it's more like, well, what kind of farm ground? Oh, just your average farm. Well, what is that? You know, what does that mean to them? And that's when I try to outline kind of, you know, the land values and lease trends booklet that we're going to be getting, you know, tomorrow here. That's when I try to give them a little more depth, so they realize, like, hey, it's not that cut and dry. It's not black and white. There's a lot that goes into this. It's very complex. So in a polite way, I try to let them know that question doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, and like I said, it would be just like, you know, I think, Dave, you do live in Bloomington, right?
I do.
Yeah. So asking a blanket question of anybody that lives in Bloomington, what's a house worth in Bloomington? Well,
What kind of
it's the
house?
same thing. And
Where's it located?
I actually have turned that on residential agents a couple times. They say, well, what are farms selling for? I said, well, I don't know. What are houses in Decatur selling for? You know, well, it depends. Well, it depends on farms too. So now I want to really kind of, well, we've already kind of touched on some of those things, but things that we have to deal with specifically in contracts, and I know the RLI has a standard form contract that their members use, and how important it is that we have those, and understanding what all of those different issues that we have to deal with when we are negotiating those contracts. And one of the first things that comes up, I think, in my mind is, first thing is, you know, how are you going to handle current crops, or where are you at in that process? And, you know, is the seller willing to give up their share, and those kind of things. So we always have to negotiate those. Where are you at in the growing or the crop season? And you want to address some of that and different ways that you can handle it.
But Dave.
He's not reaching for it.
He's not reaching.
So a lot of it obviously depends on the time of year. You know, obviously if you're in between growing seasons with farmland, sometimes you can make it pretty obvious, and, you know, 18 stays with who owned it during 18 and got the income, and 19 will stay with, or go with whoever's going to be buying the farm. There are some instances where, you know, things need done mid-season, and or potentially you could you know, sell a farm in May, right after something got planted, and occasionally then you can address, okay, maybe we can make this transaction happen, but this contract spells out who's going to pay for the expenses. Maybe there's some reimbursements to be worked into the language. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons I love the RLI contract, and it's not to demean any other contract, but it's a contract for land brokers, by land brokers, that's looked at on an annual basis and tweaked. And that way we're all on the same playing field. When, you know, we go from up north to down south, we're all starting at the same place.
And I find it interesting too, because sometimes I've had situations where we've utilized a contract, the RLI contract, and then one side or the other takes it to their attorney, and then the attorney is lost. I mean, because they don't deal with it, and start to ask some of those questions. Another area that I wanted to talk about a little bit was about how we have to deal with government programs within those real estate purchase contracts, because those could be an issue.
So the majority of farms are enrolled in a farm program, a USDA farm program. If they aren't, that could be a detriment because there's money to be gained from participating in those from year to year.
Trump money.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. If you weren't signed up, you weren't eligible, and so you couldn't get those dollars that just came kind of out of the sky at the end of the growing season. So in order to be a participant in those, you want to make sure the farm is enrolled in the USDA farm program, and that contracts have been signed, the tenant has been appropriately reporting acres and things of that nature every year. The other thing we deal with, so that's an item that needs to be addressed in a contract, and who gets those payments, or who is responsible for following through with that after the contract is signed, and is the new buyer going to be responsible for continuing to be a part of that program, making sure that's in the contract, things of that nature, and abiding to the rules that go with that. And CRP contracts are the same way. So Conservation Reserve Program payments are very important that way. That the fact that if you don't, or if the new buyer doesn't continue to adhere to the contract that was signed, then people that were paid could be responsible for the money that was paid to them, even though they didn't violate the contract after the closing.
Well, and the interesting part, and Ray, I specifically want to ask you this because I'm sure over the years you've sold a lot of what was farmland that may have been in government programs and then became developed, because that was an issue, I'm sure, wasn't it?
Yep.
Or did it not matter because they got so much they didn't care?
That's really what it was in many cases at that route.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was mentioned on the CRP contracts, there's cases where the money goes to the farm operator. He's the one who signed it up, and now what do you got? When it comes time for a closing, he's no longer there, new farm operator. So what we found, and I see some head shaking here, you got to go to FSA, and they've got it. Everybody's got to agree to a release. The operator who was on that 10-year contract has to agree. He's releasing, and the new people can get onto it. FSA. They don't take that lightly, as some of you probably know. So this is another thing we advise. They're going to flip to the farm management side. I do not want any of my CRP contracts or CREP contracts in the farm operator's name, period, just because of those issues. Now, he may help participate in seeding and all that, great, you pay him for it. But God, don't get into that situation.
And that's a great point. I actually just closed on a property this year where I'm not even sure the landowner was aware that the operator was receiving 25% of the CRP payment. And sometimes they're not just gonna gladly sign away money either. And so sometimes when negotiating, it kind of ends up being some of these side deals. In this case, to get him to sign off, because the buyer wanted 100% of the CRP income moving forward, but in doing so, he essentially, requested a buyout, and was something that we had to provide. I would also just stress, don't make any assumptions. A lot of times, things that don't even really appear to be in CRP can be in CRP. In fact, there's a listing we just had in Cass County where if I wouldn't have, gone to the USDA and gone through all the proper steps of gathering the data, I wouldn't have known that there was a couple waterways that there's CRP waterways. I mean, most waterways aren't, but there are CRP waterways. So don't assume anything.
I got one more thing that's important this year is that, especially at this timing, is who's going to sign up the farm for the new farm program. And at this point in time, in 2019, for 2020, you've got kind of a 2-year period where you get to decide what program you're going to be in. And right now, who makes that decision if you're in the middle of negotiating a contract for a farm over the next few months? So that's an important thing that's topical right now.
Right.
The other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about kind of ties in with expenses or things like that, but I'm sure we've always had situations where and this may go back into termination of leases and things like that, that if the existing tenant agreed to give up the farm, but maybe they had, you know, because these things come up afterwards, but they'd already fall-tilled it. So of course, they want to be paid for that going forward, or maybe had applied fertilizer or lime or something else. So those are other things that have to be negotiated through and worked through. And real estate taxes. Now this is an interesting component. I think, you know, we had a little class and structure, and most generally your real estate taxes on farmland are pretty simple. It's whoever got the income usually are the ones who are going to pay the tax. But, and it's usually year to year, but have you ever had to, like, when you sold a farm, then prorate like the residents and things like that? So you've got part of it that is prorated annually, and then other components that are actually prorated to the day of closing.
I suppose it depends on how it's sold. So
Yes,
if
yes.
if the farmhouse and farmstead is sold off separately, obviously that would be something where you might prorate the taxes on the farmstead itself. But if it's sold with the farm, a lot of times
Yeah.
it's all just based upon who got the crop or who got the money from
Right.
the rent that year. And
Okay.
and,
Okay, was curious if you had ever had any of those situations where they weren't sold separately, but they did prorate to the day of closing for the improvements, but not the farmland.
I can't say that I ever have, actually.
Okay. Anybody? Okay. So real estate taxes, of course, and normally it's not something that's prorated to the day of closing. All right, famous, now, mineral rights. Any leases, wind turbines, solar farms, or solar panels?
Right.
You're the expert.
Yeah,
Let's talk
so,
about that a little bit.
I mean, mineral rights are.
And this
one
is
thing.
as it's being sold.
Right,
If you're gonna be
so-
offering for
Yeah,
solar.
are they retained, are they not retained, are they going with the property, what about the future mineral rights? Those items have to be discussed in the negotiation, I would say, of who's going to get those. It's not always necessarily as big of a deal in Illinois as it is in some of the southwestern states, where you've got more oil and things of that nature, but we do deal with mineral rights. Mineral rights are sometimes sold off of a farm, and you don't even know it, and that gets back to the whole preliminary title work. Go get your preliminary title work, ask for the mineral rights to be researched as well, because those types of things, and sometimes you have to actually ask certain counties to research those mineral rights, otherwise they won't do it. So going through that process, knowing what you've got to sell can be important. I know of, it didn't happen to me, but another realtor who did not go through that process, didn't know it. It was fair to him, it wasn't necessarily typical in that area. And all of a sudden, he got to closing, right before closing, gave the buyer the copy of the preliminary title work, and the oil rights had been sold off on it. And then the buyer said, well, that's a flaw, I don't want to close. And it's an exception to the contract. So as a result, they end up negotiating a lower price for the farm to reflect the fact that those oil rights were no longer part of the farm. Now, I don't know if there was oil ever under the farm, but that buyer was a shrewd buyer, and he used that to his advantage and kind of put the seller in a bit of a corner.
And I'm sure there's some of you that are in the southern part of the state where there have been existing oil wells and things like that and leases. Does anybody want to address that? Because I don't think any of you guys really have dealt with it.
Brett, do you want to deal with fracking and things of that nature? Or
Have me repeat it.
Yeah, we're gonna, and Roger, you probably have some experience with that as well. So I might want to have you talk a little bit about that, because I think it is something that we have to think. And see, there's a lot of areas of the state, especially I would say north of 36, we don't deal with it much, you know, because we haven't had that experience. Quick, Brett?
If you didn't hear me, like I said, I had an auction that did not sell a few years ago because the owners were not releasing mineral rights. And we advertised it that way before the auction. And there was a lot of questions at the auction about it, and the owners refused to release them, and the property did not sell. And like David said, very likely with these minerals under.
Roger, you want to add to that?
Very similar situations. We've sold some property in the oil field area,
And we basically had those folks sign off on it before we had the auction for their commitment to release those oil rights. And what was brought up earlier by Dave in reference to when we're starting to sell a piece of property anymore, the title companies, which we work with them all over several states, we're having the title work done when there's a commitment to sell a piece of property. We call the title company that day, and we bring it up to within 30 days of if it's going to be an auction or something, we set a date so that we can see. We had one situation that had a mechanic's lien on a piece of property that was 40 or 50 years old, and it was back in the woods. Nobody knew about it, all right? The person that actually placed it was dead. So, I mean, but we had to go through the legal ramifications. Another thing that's not a highly discussed thing, but we got into on a piece of property was gas storage. And that's something that goes on in the southern part of the state where they actually use the underground storage caverns that are naturally in there to store natural gas and deal with that and those storage rights.
Okay. Yeah, and I was going to touch on those kind of issues that I think that play out, and Winnie may have had some experience with this too, but environmental issues. And I think we could always remember or recall or think about, you know, underground storage tanks, pipelines that go through, maybe a decommissioned oil well, which happens, you know, in some of our area. We had a little touch of that. But even more so, and is the problem that you've had with the coal mines over in that area where we had subsidence. And you want to talk about that a little bit, Winnie? Have you ever had a farm that had that issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I helped you sell one on auction that way. And you could literally look across this and it went, oh, and then like that.
And these low drainage areas that you can't drain in our area sometimes because it is so flat. And those subsidence areas just sometimes make it very, very difficult to drain, and oftentimes will bring a huge discount as a result.
Yeah, because I know we're over in the eastern part of Douglas County and western part of Edgar, where they had mined underground, deep underground mines that have now since quit, or they're not there anymore, but we do get that subsidence. And so those are all issues that we have to deal with. Anybody else?
Well, we started talking about wind and solar too. Do you want to?
Yes, yeah, I want to address that.
Well, with wind farms, we've certainly had to deal with some of those now that we've had up for 10 or 15 years. And sometimes we go to divide those contracts up. So maybe it's a 240 acre farm and we divide it up into 380s and there's 2 wind turbines on it. And so then how does that money get split? And those things are all a difficult process sometimes with the wind company even to understand how they want to split those payments when they go from a 240 to 380s. And so those items are things that have to be discussed and researched ahead of time to make sure you can do what you think you want to do when you go to sell a property. A wind easement, sometimes it's seen as positive, sometimes it's seen as negative. There are some positive cash flows to it, which can sometimes help it bring more money. But there's some areas of the state where it's not necessarily seen as positive, and so it doesn't necessarily bring more money because it's got a wind turbine on it. And sometimes it depends on how much the payment is. And so as the older projects get older, sometimes those are worth less money because there's less future value, whereas the newer ones tend to bring a little bit more.
To talk a little bit about the solar farm issue, has anybody had any experience with negotiating those type of things yet? I know they've gotten some approved. Rick, you have? Rob, I'm sorry. I said Rick. Yeah, I'd like to, a little bit more about those. And, you know, specifically, too, what does that do as far as, you know, was it a 20 acre coverage, 10 acre, 40 acres, what was it?
Well, the lease we've signed is for approximately 45 acres, and it's been approved by the Logan County Board, and we're just waiting now for the state lottery. And it's roughly $1,000 an acre per year on that. And we made them put it out on the worst piece of the ground. The trustee said, no, we're not gonna put it on the good ground. So we're going on the rough sand hill that the tenant always whines about paying too much rent on, so.
Okay. Now, do we know, okay, and I'm just kind of asking a hypothetical here. Was that farm in a government program?
It's in the regular farm program.
Okay. Does that have any effect on that you're aware of?
FSA just sent out an email this week saying that if it goes into a solar, that they will reduce basis on those farms. So they consider it going out of production.
Okay. That was kind of my question, what effect it might have on those. And obviously, different programs may have different issues, but they are an issue. So, anybody else, solar panel farming?
I think one of the things that they probably had to sign off on when he signed up also was, as he did some due diligence, probably whether there's CRP on it or not. I'm guessing there isn't, but that was one of the things that a lot of times the solar companies would check on to make sure that they weren't violating the CRP contract, to make sure they weren't going to get in trouble there and have to pay back that money as well, if it's approved. And that has actually been delayed until April 10th, I think I saw yesterday.
Have they determined if it's not acceptable cover on CRP?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because water is acceptable cover on CRP.
But with the improvement on it, then it's, I'm not sure. So,
Yeah.
we know the answer to everything like that.
Yeah, well, but once again, it's another issue that, you know, that we may have to deal with and work through. Now, the famous possession.
Right? Yes.
Well, you know, because a lot of times we sell these farms all through the year. I mean, we have our hot season, if you want to call it that. But, you know, a lot of times, especially for those farms that are sold, let's say, late harvest. Maybe the crop's off, maybe it's not. But even if it isn't, of course, that tenant farmer still has the opportunity to take that off and all of that. But then, of course, the new buyer wants to come in and fall till. So how do you deal with those kind of issues?
Well, it takes, you know, it usually is not a problem. Most of the people that are farming it are not going to get it again. I have not, frankly, years and years ago we had a problem with it. Today, it's very rare. We just communicate. Just say, look, we have a new buyer. He wants to come on as soon as harvest is complete. We don't want to push him off the combines. And although we talked to one of the members here today that actually a different kind of lease, and yeah, they still just got the corn out, I think, here a week or two ago. But hopefully there's not going to be much of that. But I think the fact is that it's just take cooperation amongst everybody, and it usually works out pretty well.
Yeah.
That's what we're learning.
Well, and maybe you've had this issue then too, where there were grain facilities on the farm, and the existing tenant used those facilities. Yep. And of course, normally they're gonna have access till the 1st of March of the following year, so talk about that.
And we've had that too, and you know, roads are posted at a certain point in time. So the question is, even let's say you closed January 15th, or maybe it was in December, and what we do, we work out an agreement. It's usually in a written side agreement that you have the ability to take that grain out by March 15th. Now, you're not going to use the bins anyway, the new buyer, until next fall. So most times they'll say, hey, just in a reasonable period of time, we're going to be good. We're going to be good with that. So we communicate that as well, so everybody doesn't get mad. Because like I say, there's times you can't ride in the semis on those roads. You just can't do it. So it just against cooperation, but I think there needs to be a good agreement between everybody that this is what's going to really probably happen too.
Okay.
The RLI contract also addresses possession.
Right, it does. Yeah, absolutely, it does.
It does.
And of course, if you're not a member of RLI, you have no access to those, but
That's right.
they do work out well. Anything else on to add on that?
Well, I had another one. This is recent. The closing took place the first week in January, and there's equipment. There's equipment that from and the seller was his brother, his nephew, I guess, farmed the farm, and he had some combine heads and stuff in the sheds, and had quite a time with the attorney for the buyer. He said, no, he's got to get it out of there. I said, no, That's not how it's gonna work. So we had to override the attorney and say, look, it's between the two, the buyer and the seller here, is how it's gonna work. And so they worked it out, and actually, it was just last week, per agreement, the equipment got removed. And he said, well, possession's possession, he should get everything. Not necessarily do you have to do it that way. So it was one of the attorneys that, you know, played a little different game.
Well, and technically too, if the lease ran through February 28th, he technically had possession, tenant's rights to the farm until
Yep.
February 28th. So
Yep.
he had possession until at least that date.
Yeah.
And you find, I'm sure, that a lot of times you deal with attorneys that are not used to dealing with these kind of issues, and it can sometimes cause even more problems.
Just about made the deal crater, actually.
Right, so.